Ambassador Zixtal adjusted his ceremonial sash for the 47th time that morning, each motion precisely calculated to maximize the shimmer of his iridescent scales under the council chamber's carefully calibrated lighting. The things I must endure, he thought, mandibles clicking in barely concealed irritation. The mere presence of a human at the 1000th Annual Galactic Strategic Competition was enough to give him acute digestive distress. I must protest, he announced to the assembled council, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into the standard galactic format with what he considered an appropriately dignified tone. The inclusion of a Deathworlder, he managed to make the word sound like something found stuck to the bottom of a waste processing unit in our most sacred competition threatens to undermine a millennium of tradition. From her position in the competitor's booth, Commander Elena the Menace Martinez kept her face carefully neutral, though the corners of her mouth twitched. After 5 years representing humanity in these diplomatic circles, she'd developed an almost encyclopedic collection of alien expressions for uncivilized brute. The way Zixtal's secondary antennae curled every time he looked in her direction was definitely going in her top 10. Point of order, warbled first speaker KTHEL, their gelatinous form rippling with the practiced patience of one who had moderated far too many of these sessions. The human delegation's application was properly filed, notarized in triplicate, submitted to the Committee for Evaluation of New Species Integration, approved by the Subcommittee for Competition Qualification Standards, and finally ratified by the Board of Historical Games Preservation. They paused for dramatic effect, all within the mandatory 17-cycle waiting period. Elena bit back a laugh. She'd spent 3 months navigating that bureaucratic maze, and watching it being used to shut down Zixtal's protest was worth every excruciating minute. But there, from a Class 12 Deathworld, Zixtal's scales were shifting to an interesting shade of puce. They evolved throwing pointy sticks at apex predators. Their idea of diplomatic relations probably involves hitting problems with increasingly larger rocks until they go away. Actually, Elena interjected smoothly, we usually start with medium-sized rocks and work our way down. Saves energy, she smiled sweetly as several of the more delicate species in the chamber made distressed whistling sounds. The thing was, Zixtal wasn't entirely wrong about Earth. Humans had evolved on a planet that seemed designed by a committee of sadistic physics professors, where everything either wanted to eat you, poison you, or both at the same time. But that's exactly why Elena was here. While the rest of the galaxy had spent millennia developing elaborate strategic competitions to avoid actual conflict, humans had been playing chess while simultaneously wondering if that rustle in the bushes was going to try to have them for dinner. The competition rules are clear, first speaker KAL announced, their surface rippling with what Elena had learned to recognize as smug satisfaction. All recognized spacefaring species may send one representative to compete in the great game. Species status is not dependent upon planetary classification. Zixtal's protests devolved into a series of clicks that his translator tactfully declined to process. Elena resisted the urge to wave at him. The ambassador had no idea that his vocal opposition was actually helping her. Every species in the galaxy had labeled humans as surprisingly clever for barbarians, which meant they consistently underestimated just how much strategy you learned when your entire evolutionary history was one long series of problems that wanted to eat you. As the council chamber erupted into its usual chaos of procedural motions and subclause citations, Elena reviewed her notes on the competition's format. 1,000 years of galactic tradition had created a game so complex it made 5-dimensional chess look like tic-tac-toe. The rules document alone had its own gravitational field. But Elena had spotted something during her preparation, a tiny oversight that had been carried forward through centuries of careful refinement, something that every civilized species had overlooked because they were too sophisticated to even consider it. She smiled, remembering the words of her first tactical instructor, sometimes the best strategy is to ignore what everyone knows is impossible. The games were about to begin, and Elena the Menace. Martinez was going to show the galaxy why humans had survived their death world long enough to reach the stars. The Great Hall of Strategic Excellence named by committee. Obviously buzzed with anticipation as first speaker KATL's form shimmered through the spectrum of ceremonial colors before settling on the traditional azure of announcement. This year's challenge, they proclaimed, their translation crystals broadcasting in all 17 official galactic languages, honors our Centaurian hosts with a modified version of their ancient battle chess, the Grand Siege of Seven Spheres. Holographic displays materialized throughout the hall, showing a three-dimensional game board with multiple interconnected levels. 7 crystalline spheres hung in delicate orbital patterns around a central fortress, each one housing miniature armies and resources. Elena heard the barely concealed snickers from the Vulperian delegation behind her. "Watch the primitive try to comprehend orbital mechanics," one whispered. "I heard they only achieved spaceflight because they kept strapping bigger explosions to their ships." "Actually," Elena muttered under her breath, "we started with medium-sized explosions and worked our way up." She kept her focus on the game board, mind already racing through possibilities. The rules explanation droned on for what felt like several geological ages. Each sphere represented a different tactical advantage: resource generation, unit production, defensive capabilities, and so forth. Players had to maintain complex supply lines between their spheres while attempting to breach their opponent's fortress. The traditional winning strategy involved a careful dance of positioning and resource management that typically lasted several days. But something wasn't quite right. Elena pulled up the complete rulebook on her datapad, all 47,000 pages of it. While other competitors were already running simulations of classic winning strategies, she found herself drawn to a section that everyone else seemed to ignore: the original military foundations of the game. "Quite fascinating, isn't it?" A silky voice interrupted her thoughts. Ambassador Zextal had slithered over, his scales now a patronizing shade of mauve. "Though perhaps a bit beyond the strategic complexity your species is accustomed to. I believe you still solve some disputes through ritualized physical combat." "Only on Thursdays," Elena replied absently, still scrolling through the rules. "We use rock, paper, scissors the rest of the week." The ambassador made a sound like someone strangling a kazoo. "Your attempt at humor only reinforces my point. This game has been refined over centuries to represent the pinnacle of civilized warfare simulation. Each move must be carefully calculated, each resource precisely allocated. What happens if someone just blows up the spheres?" The silence that followed her question was absolute. Even the ambient hum of environmental systems seemed to pause in shock. What Zextal's scales cycled through several colors not previously known to exist. "The spheres," Elena said, pointing to a subsection of the rules she'd discovered. "There's nothing in here that explicitly prevents a player from targeting the spheres themselves instead of the armies on them. The rule about maintaining sphere integrity is in the environmental safety guidelines, not the actual game mechanics." But that's not how the game is played." Zextal's translator was struggling to convey his level of horror. "The spheres are the foundation of all strategy. They're essential to the proper flow of battle. You can't just blow them up," Elena suggested helpfully. She could practically see the ambassador's brain attempting to divide by zero. That would be barbaric, uncivilized, completely counter to a millennium of strategic doctrine. "Funny thing about doctrine," Elena mused, pulling up Earth's military history on her datapad. "It tends to work great until someone does something unexpected. Did you know that Earth once had unsinkable ships? Right up until someone sank them." As Zextal stormed off to presumably file another formal protest, Elena dove deeper into her research. The game's original design was based on actual military encounters from the early days of galactic expansion. Back then, the spheres had represented real space stations and resource outposts. The game had evolved into an elaborate dance of position and counterposition, but its military roots remained. And military history was something humans understood all too well. Elena spent the next several hours combining Earth's historical battle tactics with the game's mechanics. The Mongols' strategic mobility, Napoleon's artillery innovations, modern asymmetric warfare doctrine. She pulled from everything. Where other species saw an elegant dance of resources and position, she saw vulnerabilities and pressure points. The other competitors were running simulations of classic strategies, each one a variation on moves that had been played countless times before. Elena was running physics calculations on structural stress points. Commander Martinez, a nervous-looking junior aide, approached her workspace. The preliminary rounds begin in 1 hour. Would you like to review the traditional opening positions? Elena looked up from her datapad, where she'd just finished modeling what would happen if someone introduced a cascade failure in the sphere network's gravitational stabilizers. No need, she said with a smile that made the aide take an involuntary step backward. I think I'll try something a little different. As she gathered her materials for the first round, Elena couldn't help but appreciate the irony. The galaxy's civilized species had spent so long perfecting the art of bloodless warfare that they'd forgotten the fundamental lesson every human child learned on the playground: sometimes the winning move isn't the most elegant one. It was time to show the galaxy why humans had survived long enough to reach the stars, and it had nothing to do with playing by the rules. The first sign that something was very, very wrong came during Elena's opening match against the Arcturian champion. Instead of the traditional resource sphere opening gambit, she immediately began concentrating her forces on a single point in the lowest sphere's structural support network. Unfortunate positioning error, murmured the Arcturian observers. Clearly demonstrates the primitive's lack of strategic understanding. 3 moves later, the entire lower sphere collapsed, taking out 2 others in its gravitational wake. The Arcturian champion's carefully planned supply lines vanished into simulated space debris. The match ended in 11 minutes, a new record. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ambassador Zixtal choking on his ceremonial refreshments. As Elena walked off the gaming floor, her mind drifted back to her Special Forces training. Specifically, to that memorable day in the Amazon when her unit had been tasked with defending a base against theoretically overwhelming odds. Remember, Lieutenant Chen had said, studying the terrain, sometimes the best defense is making sure there's nothing left to defend. They'd blown the bridges leading to their position, turned the access road into a swamp, and waited. The opposing force had arrived with their superior numbers and fancy equipment, only to find that getting to the target was now more costly than taking it. Elena applied the same principle to her second match. The Valaxian champion had barely finished arranging their pieces in the classic defensive spiral when Elena triggered a cascade failure in their resource management system. The resulting feedback loop turned their carefully balanced network into an object lesson in uncontrolled fusion reactions. This is not strategy, protested the Valaxian delegation. This is mere destruction. Funny thing about destruction, Elena replied, marking her win on the tournament board. It's technically a form of entropy management. By her third match, the other competitors were starting to adapt, or try to anyway. The Proximan champion attempted to fortify their spheres against structural attacks, which worked right up until Elena used the reinforcement energy to create a localized gravitic resonance that turned their own defenses into a weapon. The enemy's strength can be their greatest weakness, Sergeant Rodriguez had taught them during a particularly grueling urban warfare exercise. The more resources they commit to a position, the more it hurts when that position becomes compromised. As Elena advanced through the rankings, the viewing galleries grew increasingly crowded. Species that hadn't spoken to each other in centuries were huddled together, watching in horrified fascination as she systematically dismantled millennia of strategic doctrine. Did you see what she did in the 6th match? Whispered a Centaurian junior diplomat to his Valaxian counterpart. She used the environmental safety protocols as a weapon. Who even thinks of that? I heard, replied the Valaxian, all 4 eyes wide, that on their homeworld they have to constantly invent new ways to survive because their planet keeps trying to kill them. Surely that's an exaggeration. No, I read a report. They have this thing called weather that just randomly throws high-speed air at them, and they live through it. Between matches, Elena caught snippets of hurried conversations among the judges. Words like unprecedented and technically not forbidden kept coming up, usually accompanied by gestures of extreme agitation from various appendages. Her quarter-final match lasted a record-breaking 3 minutes. She'd combined the gravitic resonance technique with a modified version of the sphere collapse, creating what she privately thought of as the space station goes boom gambit. She remembered a training simulation gone wrong, where their dropship had lost power over hostile territory. Instead of aborting, her team had turned the descending ship itself into a weapon, using its failing systems to create a diversion that let them complete the mission. Sometimes the chief had said afterward, the only way out is through. Preferably through several walls and maybe a load-bearing structure or two. As Elena prepared for her semi-final match, she noticed the growing crowd of technical advisors surrounding the judges' panel. They were poring over ancient rulebooks and precedents, probably trying to find some way to disqualify her increasingly creative interpretations of acceptable strategic approaches. Ambassador Zextal had given up on proper diplomatic decorum and was openly pacing, his scales cycling through colors that suggested either extreme distress or a serious digestive malfunction. The human advances to the finals announced first speaker KTATL, their gelatinous form somehow conveying both resignation and fascination. May the great architects preserve us all. Elena studied the tournament brackets. Her final opponent would be, appropriately enough, Ambassador Zextal himself, the reigning champion from the previous cycle. As she walked past the ambassador's preparation area, she heard him frantically consulting with his strategists. But what if she targets the gravitational stabilizers again? We could try reinforcing the power grid. No, she'll just use that against us like in the Proximan match. Perhaps if we completely restructured our entire defensive doctrine in the next 3 hours. Elena smiled, remembering her first commander's favorite saying, the greatest victory isn't making the enemy fear your strength, it's making them fear their own weakness. The finals would begin in 3 hours. She had some new ideas about using emergency teleporter protocols that she was pretty sure would make Ambassador Zextal's scales fall out. Sometimes the best way to break tradition was to break everything else first. The final match began with all the ceremony one would expect from a 1,000-year-old tradition that was about to be turned completely upside down. Ambassador Zextal took his position with rigid formality, his scales set to the traditional colors of competitive dignity. Elena cracked her knuckles. May the first speakers witness this contest, intoned Kathel, their gelatinous form glowing with ceremonial bioluminescence. Let the final match of the 1,000th great game begin. Zextal opened with the classical defense, his pieces flowing into position with practiced precision. 7 spheres hummed with energy as resource networks established themselves in elegant patterns that had been refined over centuries of play. Elena didn't move a single piece. Instead, she pulled up the game's base code on her control panel and began typing. Point of order, Zextal's translator squeaked. The competitor appears to be, what are you doing? Reading the manual, Elena replied cheerfully. Specifically, the original military protocols this game was based on. Did you know that the emergency evacuation sequences were never actually removed from the code? They're just sitting there, classified as legacy environmental systems. The ambassador's scales flickered in confusion. What possible relevance could emergency protocols have to this sacred contest of strategic? He never finished the sentence. Elena had already activated the evacuation sequence in his command sphere, which immediately began transferring all troops to the nearest safe location, which he had carefully designated as the space directly above his power distribution network. The sudden mass of evacuated troops overloaded the transportation grid, creating a cascade of emergency redirects that sent ripples through the entire sphere network. As Zextal's strategists scrambled to contain the chaos, Elena triggered her second protocol. This is outrageous, someone shouted from the observation deck. She's not even moving her pieces. Technically, Elena called back. I'm moving everyone else's pieces. The rules never specified whose pieces you had to move. That's when the audience noticed what was happening to the support structure of Zextal's fortress. The emergency protocols, designed to preserve life in a crisis, were interpreting the strategic fortress as a hazard to evacuating troops. The game's safety systems were literally dismantling the ambassador's base to protect his forces. But that's not strategy. Zextal's scales had gone completely white. You're supposed to position troops, manage resources, conduct simulated warfare according to proper civilized protocols. Elena grinned as she triggered her final sequence. Here's the thing about warfare. It's not about following the enemy's rules. It's about achieving your objective, and sometimes that means thinking so far outside the box that you can't even see the box anymore. The realization hit the assembled delegates like a quantum physics lecture at a poetry reading. For 1,000 years they had refined this game based on one core assumption that warfare was about the elegant application of force through proper channels. No one had ever questioned whether those channels themselves could be turned into weapons. "She's exploiting our own safety protocols against us," shrieked a technical advisor. "The game thinks it's protecting the pieces by destroying everything that could theoretically harm them." Which, according to these original parameters Elena added helpfully, includes pretty much the entire game board. The chaos in the observation deck reached new heights as delegates from 17 species tried to simultaneously cite different sections of the rulebook. Several Vulparians had fainted. A group of Proximan scholars were frantically rewriting their doctoral theses. Ambassador Zix Tal appeared to be trying to merge with his chair through sheer force of mortification. On the game board, Elena's untouched forces stood serenely in their starting positions while Zix Tal's entire strategic network systematically deconstructed itself in the name of safety protocols that hadn't been relevant since before humans had invented the wheel. "Stop," Zix Tal finally managed. "You can't, this isn't the rules." The rules, Elena pointed out, state that victory is achieved when one player can no longer maintain a viable strategic position. I don't see anything in here about how that position has to be compromised. As if to punctuate her point, the last of Zix Tal's command spheres succumbed to its own protection protocols, evacuating its entire population into emergency holding patterns that, purely coincidentally, formed a rather unflattering caricature of the ambassador's face when viewed from above. First speaker KTL's surface rippled with what might have been suppressed laughter. The human appears to be correct. There is no specific prohibition against utilizing system protocols as a strategic element. But it's not proper, wailed a Centaurian elder. Proper, Elena raised an eyebrow. You based this game on military strategy, but you forgot the first rule of survival: use everything available to achieve your objective. On Earth, we learned that lesson the hard way, usually while something with too many teeth was trying to eat us. The game board, now largely empty except for Elena's unused forces and the scattered remnants of Zix Tal's evacuated troops, hummed peacefully. Several technical advisors were having heated discussions about the definition of strategic assets and whether emergency protocols could be classified as weapons of mass confusion. I believe. Then, first speaker KTAL announced, their form shimmering with barely contained amusement. We need to call an emergency session of the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee emergency session looked like what would happen if you combined a parliamentary debate with a quantum physics conference and then set off an anxiety bomb in the middle. 17 different species were attempting to simultaneously argue in 34 languages about the definition of strategic assets. Elena stood calmly at the center of the chaos, watching as Ambassador Zix Tal's scales shifted through colors previously unknown to optical science. Order. First speaker KL's form pulsed with authoritative bioluminescence. The human competitor will explain her. Interpretation of strategic doctrine. Elena stepped forward, pulling up historical images on the chamber's holographic display. Let me tell you about the Battle of Trebizond, Earth year 1461. The defenders had superior position, better supplies, and stronger walls. The attackers won by convincing the defenders' own engineers that a section of wall needed urgent repairs. They literally got the defenders to dismantle their own fortifications. The display shifted to show various other battles. Troy, 1184 BCE, victory achieved by turning a religious offering into a delivery system. The Trojan horse became such a famous example of tactical thinking that we named an entire category of strategies after it. But those are examples of deception, protested a Vulparian delegate. This competition is about proper military strategy. Elena smiled. Funny thing about that. On Earth, we learned pretty quickly that proper strategy is whatever keeps you alive. When everything on your planet is trying to kill you, you stop worrying about whether your survival tactics are elegant enough. She switched the display to show Earth's natural disasters. We evolved on a planet where the ground occasionally splits open and spits liquid rock at us. The air itself sometimes forms into funnels of death that can throw buildings around like toys. Our response? We built warning systems, shelters, and evacuation protocols, and then learned to use those same systems for other purposes. The chamber had grown quieter as aliens stared at images of tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and tornadoes. So when I looked at your game, Elena continued, I didn't see an elegant dance of position and counterposition. I saw safety protocols that could be repurposed, emergency systems that could be redirected, and protection schemes that could be turned into weapons. Because that's what humans do. We take systems designed to protect us from one threat and adapt them to handle new challenges. A Proximan scholar tentatively raised an appendage. But how is that proper strategic thinking? Strategy isn't about being proper, Elena replied. It's about achieving objectives with available resources. Sometimes those resources aren't weapons or troops. Sometimes they're rules and systems that everyone else takes for granted. She pulled up one final image, Earth Space Program history. When we first reached for the stars, we didn't have your elegant antimatter drives or gravity manipulators. We strapped ourselves to containers of explosive chemicals and basically pointed them up. We turned the very force that kept us planet-bound into a tool for escaping it. The chamber erupted in murmured discussions. Several technical advisors were frantically taking notes. A group of Centaurian military historians appeared to be having some sort of collective epiphany. "I move," announced a previously silent Arcturian elder, that the human strategy be recognized as valid under Section 47, subsection 11, Innovation in Strategic Thinking. "Seconded," came a chorus of voices, including, surprisingly, Ambassador Zixtal's. Elena turned to the ambassador in shock. His scales had settled into a thoughtful shade of blue. "We have spent a millennium," Zixtal said slowly, "refining our understanding of strategy based on what we assumed warfare must be. You showed us that our very assumptions could be turned against us." His mandibles clicked in what Elena had learned to recognize as respectful amusement. "It is irritatingly enlightening." First speaker Kachel's surface rippled with approval. The motion is carried. Commander Elena Martinez's victory stands, and her tactical innovations will be added to the official record of strategic doctrines. As the chamber began to clear, Elena found herself surrounded by aliens eager to discuss her approach. A Volparian military theorist wanted to know more about this fascinating concept of repurposing defensive systems. A Proximan engineer was excitedly sketching ideas for new safety protocols that couldn't be turned into impromptu weapons. "Perhaps," Ambassador Zixtal said, approaching with his scales now showing diplomatic purple, "we have been too quick to dismiss the strategic lessons learned on, what did you call them? Deathworlds?" Elena grinned. "Just wait until I tell you about how we turned our planet's bacterial defense systems into medical treatments, or how we're using viruses to fight cancer." The ambassador's scales cycled through several colors before settling on fascinated turquoise. "You weaponized your own infections?" "Ambassador," Elena said, patting him on what she hoped was his shoulder, "you have no idea what humans can weaponize when we put our minds to it. Want to hear about how we turned our waste products into fertilizer?" Several nearby aliens made sounds indicating they weren't quite ready for that level of human innovation. The official recognition ceremony for Elena's victory looked nothing like traditional galactic strategic competition closings. For one thing, half the species present were frantically taking notes instead of maintaining proper ceremonial posture. In recognition of unprecedented tactical innovation, first speaker Kay Hain announced, their gelatinous form shimmering with barely contained amusement, "We hereby present Commander Elena Martinez with the Order of Strategic Excellence and a formal request to review our emergency evacuation protocols." The laughter that rippled through the chamber would have been unthinkable just days ago. Already things were changing. The Proximan delegation had submitted 17 proposals for new safety systems, each one carefully designed to be human-proof. The Vulparians were organizing a conference titled Defensive Architecture, Are We Too Defensive? But the real changes were more subtle. Elena noticed them in the new phrases, creeping into diplomatic conversations. "Let's not pull a Martinez on this one," a Centaurian ambassador warned during trade negotiations, meaning, check if our own regulations can be used against us. They went full Earth on the problem, became galactic shorthand for solving issues in unexpectedly practical ways. The Arcturian Dictionary of Military Terms added human think as an official tactical category, defined as the disturbing ability to turn seemingly unrelated systems into strategic assets. Ambassador Zixtal, displaying unexpected adaptability, had already submitted a paper to the Strategic Council titled Reconsidering Barbarism, Practical Applications of Deathworld Innovation. His scales now regularly showed the newly named color of enlightened humiliation. "You realized," Elena told him during the closing reception, "that humans don't actually spend all our time thinking about how to turn everything into a weapon?" "No," his scales flickered uncertainly. "Of course not. Sometimes we think about how to turn weapons into other things. Want to hear about this thing called fireworks?" The ambassador's translator chose that moment to develop a convenient malfunction. As Elena prepared to return to Earth, she received one final surprise, an invitation to help revise the game's rules for the next tournament. The note attached read simply, "If we can't prevent humans from thinking like humans, we might as well learn from it." She smiled, remembering something her old drill sergeant used to say, "The universe has a sense of humor. Sometimes you just have to throw its own rules back at it and wait for the punchline." The fact that the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations were now taking strategic advice from a species they'd recently dismissed as primitive explosion enthusiasts was probably the best punchline of all. First Speaker Caithless summed it up best during the closing ceremony. "Perhaps we needed a reminder that sophistication without adaptability is just complicated stagnation. Or, as our human friends might say, sometimes you need someone to think outside the box by questioning whether you needed the box in the first place." The next year's competition would feature a new category, creative protocol repurposing. Elena made a mental note to warn them about human engineering students and their creative interpretation of safety guidelines. But that, she decided, could wait until after she'd enjoyed watching 17 species try to human-prove their rule systems. After all, if there's one thing humans excel at, it's finding new ways to make things work differently than intended. The galaxy was about to learn that lesson, one repurposed protocol at a time.